Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop from the Writing Support Center. My name is Giselle, and today's workshop is going to focus on email netiquette and how to communicate academically and professionally. This is a DLA workshop, and what that means is that this workshop is based on a directed learning activity. Specifically, it is based on the Academic Skills 2 DLA that focuses on writing an email to a professor. So please make sure to download that DLA if you haven't already. It's on the workshop page, and you can go ahead and just download it to your computer and fill it out as we go through this workshop. You will need to complete the DLA alongside the workshop, as it will help you process the material that we go through today. If you're doing this for extra credit, your DLA would serve as proof that you've completed this workshop. Another thing to note is that for DLAs, you usually need to have a tutor check it after you've completed it. However, because you are doing this DLA with the workshop, you can skip having a tutor check it unless you'd like the extra help. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and begin. Today's objectives for this workshop is to help you complete the DLA that I mentioned, the Academic Skills 2 Writing an Email to a Professor DLA. After you complete this workshop, you should be able to identify the basic do's and don'ts of professional email etiquette, and you should also be able to draft a professional and academic email to a professor. This workshop is important because I know many of you might have transferred from high school, or some of you might be international students, and email etiquette is something that is super important, especially now that everything is remote. So with this workshop, my hope is that you're able to internalize certain email netiquette strategies so that next time you have to write an email to a professor, you feel more confident in how you're communicating. So the first part of the DLA focuses on the basic setup of an email. So when you do email a professor, always make sure you're using a professional email address. This goes also for any jobs you might be reaching out to. You always want to make sure your email address sounds professional. One way to make it professional when you're emailing your professors is to use your PCC student email address. That email address is the best when you're emailing your professors because it's provided to you from the school, and your professor most likely already has that email address for you on file. So it's always good practice to use your student email address if you are emailing a professor. If you don't want to use your student email address, go ahead and use an email address that reflects your name. So this could be your first and last name at gmail.com or at yahoo.com, whichever email service you'd like to use. Just make sure that it reflects your name. It could also be your first initial last name and some numbers. It could be your first name, last initial, and numbers. But as long as it reflects your name, that's what's most important. Don't use any email addresses that contain any obscene, explicit, or vague references. Those are best kept for your personal communication. Definitely not something you want to use when you're trying to communicate with someone professionally. Some sample appropriate email addresses, like I was mentioning above, are something like jdoe@go.pasadena.edu, johndoe12@gmail.com, or jdoe92@gmail.com. Any of those emails would be professional enough to use with a professor, or like I said, a job that you're reaching out to. So just make sure, step one, that your email address is professional. After you've made sure your email address is professional, you also want to create a signature. Now, a signature for your email is not required. You do not need to have a signature. However, it's a great way for recipients to be able to identify you and contact you if need be. So some things that people include in their email signature are their full name, their major and program, college, address, phone, and email. You don't need to include all of these things. Just include what you feel comfortable including. Like for example, when I say address, I don't mean your home address. I would say like the college address, but you don't need to do that. You could just put Pasadena City College if you'd like. Another thing to note is that on the DLA, there's a space for you to put an email address. I forgot to mention this in the previous slide, but if you haven't already, there's a question number 1 on the DLA. Go ahead and write in an email address that you plan to use or already use for academic and professional communication. After you've done that, then you can try creating a sample signature. There's also another part of question 1 on the DLA that allows you to practice creating your own signature on the worksheet. And to create that signature, like I said, you could use any of the following information. Definitely include your full name and your email address in your signature, but you can also include all of these things. And after you've created that signature, it would look something like this. I used Harry Potter as an example, just because that's a character that a lot of people would probably know. But this is what Harry Potter's signature would look like if he decided to use an email signature. So like I said, go ahead, take a moment. You can pause here if you'd like and practice creating an email signature that you'd be comfortable using. All right, so after that setup of your email has been done, you want to then move on to what goes into the actual email. So the subject line is one of the most important basic needs for every email you write. You want it to be clear and specific about the topic of the email, and it should highlight the main point of the email. So in short, you really want your subject line to be concise, so direct and short. You don't want a really long email subject line just because it will get cut off. So it's best that you just put in something that gets straight to the point, but also communicates the main point of the email. Don't include any greetings in your subject line or a generic topic in the subject line. So hello or question would be considered generic topics. I would avoid putting things like that in your email. Instead, if you do have a question, put the subject of the question in your subject line instead of just putting a general question, because your recipient's going to be unsure of what you have a question about. Some of these would be good subject lines if you do decide to revise, a subject line when you're typing your email. These are some subject lines that would be good to use. So English 1A feedback requested for Essay 2. This would notify your professor exactly what your need is, and it also identifies which class you're in. Sometimes professors have a lot of courses, right, or students in their courses, and maybe they are teaching like 4 courses, right? So it's easy for them when you put the course title in your email, just because it gives them a sense of what class you're in, and it's easier for them to identify you quicker. Seeking advice for in-class essay. So this is straightforward again, letting your professor know that you're looking for advice on your in-class essay. Absence on the date, right? The date is included in that subject line. So it's very important when you're emailing about absences, which you probably won't be doing right now since we're all remote. But once we return to campus, putting that absence and the date in the subject line is very helpful. And then late for class, that's another one that you would use when we come back from being remote. But you can also use something like missing assignment, right? So if you forgot an assignment, you forgot to turn it in, you could also put like late assignment for English 1A class on this date. So you could also utilize the date and the class name and number in the subject line that way. So like I said, the main point is when you are drafting the subject line, it's clear what you need help with so that your professor or whoever you're emailing can assist you more efficiently. So now we're going to practice writing our own subject lines. On the worksheet, there's a space you'll see for both scenario 1 and scenario 2. And you can go ahead and take a minute to try drafting the subject line for both of these scenarios. My main point of advice, to repeat what I was saying in the previous slide, is remember to keep it short but direct and clear. So scenario one, you are having a hard time starting an essay that is due in a week. You need to request an appointment to meet with your professor this week because you cannot make their office hours. Draft a short but direct subject line. So that would be scenario one. Again, this is applicable to the remote setting because if your professor is holding office hours over Zoom, you would still need to communicate with them to request an appointment outside of their office hours. So this is both information that's good for you when you return to campus and while we're remote. Scenario two, you're feeling sick and you will need to miss your English 1A class the following day. So currently being remote, you're not going to need to talk about, missing class is much different unless you're missing a synchronous sessions, because I know some of us are in synchronous courses or some of you, the students, are in synchronous courses. So that means you have to attend a Zoom session for your course. So if you are in a synchronous Zoom course, it is really important that you do email your professor. If you're going to be late, you want to treat synchronous courses the same way that you would treat in-person courses. So giving your professor the heads up that you're going to miss class is always a great practice. So looking at both these scenarios, go ahead and take a minute. You can pause the video here and draft a short but direct subject line that you could put in an email if you were emailing your professor about either one of these scenarios. Okay, so I hope you're able to draft your subject lines. If not, go ahead and pause and finish up doing that. For the next exercise, we're going to be talking about drafting the actual email body. So the previous slides were talking about how to set up your email. We're moving into how to actually write the body of your email. So all emails need the following: a greeting, a polite and non-demanding body, and a closing phrase. Those are the basic necessities for all emails. You also want to make sure your email contains proper punctuation and grammar and no profanity or internet slang. In keeping email communication professional and academic, especially if it's a professor that you don't have quite a rapport with, yet you don't want to use any internet slang. So no LOL or LMAO or any of the internet slang that you might use on social media or in text. You want to avoid using that when emailing your professor. So always try to write with proper punctuation and grammar when you do email your professor. Of course, you're not graded on your email etiquette, but it's just good practice, especially because when you start emailing jobs or emailing your resume, this is great practice for you to make sure that your emails sound professional and academic. The first thing that goes into your email, like I mentioned above, is a greeting. So a greeting is just something like, dear so-and-so, hi so-and-so, hello so-and-so. For all formal emails, you do want to use dear plus the recipient's title and last name. So in my case, it could be Dear Professor Miralles if you were sending me an email. Or you could just say, hi Giselle, if you and I have a more have a rapport established, right? But if you don't have a rapport established with the professor, if they haven't given you the okay to call them by their first name, it's always best practice to just go by Professor so-and-so when you're emailing them. You also want to make sure that your greeting matches a tone. So like I said, if you want to be more formal, you could use dear, but hi and hello are also acceptable email communicate. They're also acceptable greetings if you do want to be a little less formal. So for example, if you're writing to someone like Albus Dumbledore, you would say, Dear Professor Dumbledore, right? You wouldn't say, Dear Professor Albus Dumbledore. You would take out the first name and keep the last name. It's always smart to use titles like Professor or Doctor when you're emailing your professor, just because they're gender neutral. You never want to assume someone's gender. So remaining gender neutral is always the best way to go. So if you know if your professor signs their emails by using doctor, you could go ahead and say Dr. Dumbledore, right, when you email them back. just make sure you're using one of the two. It's much better, it's much more preferred over honorifics like Ms., Mr., Miss, because those have obvious gender attached to them. Your professor might have already told you in class too what to refer to them as, and you would just default to whatever they told you before. So if your professor already told you, hey, call me by my first name, or hey, call me Professor so-and-so, just default to what they've told you already. So after you've typed out your greeting, you also want to start drafting the body of your email, and your tone is very important when writing an email. It's important to always maintain a polite and non-demanding tone. So this table right here is going to give you some ideas of how you can switch out more demanding language with more polite and non-demanding language. So for example, instead of saying something like, let's see, I want to make an appointment with you, right? So you are trying to schedule time to meet with your professor outside of office hours, and you want to set up a Zoom appointment with them. So instead of saying, I want to make an appointment with you, ask them, do you have time to meet with me sometime this week? So this table, like I said, is going to give you some substitutions for more demanding language. So make sure to refer to this if you do have any questions about whether or not your tone sounds demanding. You can also find this table on the DLA. So if you save the DLA, you can also refer to the DLA later on so that you can use these substitutions if needed. Okay, so for exercise 2, we're still talking about drafting the email. So the next thing after you've typed out your opening, as in your greeting, and the body of your email, you also want to type out a closing phrase. The closing phrase is important because it signals the end of your email. It's also used before you sign your name and or include your signature if you decide to include a signature. So some acceptable closing phrases that you might see often are best, thank you, kind regards, and sincerely. Any one of those 4 closing phrases would be great to close your email out with. Some inappropriate closing phrases that might be more well used with personal relationships, but not so great with professional relationships are love, thanks, yours truly, and XOXO. These are just much more informal, and they also communicate a much closer relationship. So you definitely want to avoid using these when you're emailing your professors. Thanks, like the THX version of thanks, would be inappropriate because again, it's using that internet slang I talked about in the previous slide. So like I said, just default to one of these 4 when you close your email. They're going to be the most acceptable closing phrases that you can use when signing off. So there are inappropriate ways to email, as I mentioned. This sample is a sample of what would be considered inappropriate if you're trying to maintain a professional tone in your email. So for example, this student wrote confused. So I'm not going to explain why. I'll go over it in a second, but I want you to think about why this email is inappropriate. So in this email, the student says, Mrs. Minerva McGonigal, I didn't understand the lecture yesterday about topic sentences and paragraph structure. I want to make an appointment with you tomorrow at 12 so you can explain it to me more because I need to know this stuff for the next essay. Thanks, HP. So I just want you to look at this email draft and think about the issues present. On your DLA worksheet, you'll be able to write out what issues are present. So just take a moment to write out those issues. You can pause here and then continue after you've written out the issues that you see in this email. Okay, so I hope you had time. If not, go ahead and pause and continue writing. And once you're done, move on to the next slide. So some of the issues I see in this email are the subject line, right? So the subject line is very vague. Like I said, you want to avoid putting in vague subject lines. You want to make sure that when the professor sees your email, they will know what you are emailing them about, right? So this title, confused, I have no idea what the student is confused about. If you go through the paragraph or the body of the email, there are a lot of typos, right? So there's Mrs. with a comma. There's a small I here. There's also no greeting present, right? So there's no dear Mrs. Minerva McGonagall, hello, Mrs. Minerva McGonagall, or hi, Mrs. Minerva McGonagall. There's none of that in this. So there's also the usage of Mrs., right, instead of the gender neutral professor or doctor. There's another small I here. So there's a lot of typos, as I said. There's also some internet slang here where it says cuz and thanks. There's also very little punctuation. And the student also says, I want to make an appointment with you tomorrow at 12. So that sounds like a demand. It doesn't sound like the student is being mindful of the professor's schedule. Professors are very busy, so the professor might not have time at 12, but when the student phrases it this way, it very much sounds like a demand, and it sounds like the student is saying, I don't have any other time but 12, and that's the only time I can meet you. So that can definitely be softened in this email. The sort of demanding tone can be brought down a bit. So those are some issues I saw. You might have seen other issues that I didn't spot, but those are some of the issues I saw. Okay, so this one's a rewritten and acceptable email of the one I just showed you. So the subject reads English 1A, appointment requested about lesson, and then Tuesday 2:30 to 12:1, which I assume is the time of the class. Dear Professor McGonagall, during today's class, Tuesday 12:1, 2:30 to 3:45, I had some difficulty understanding how to effectively use topic sentences for my body paragraphs. I am especially concerned about this since Essay 1 is due next Tuesday. Since your office hours take place during one of my other classes, would you be available to meet with me sometime this week? Thank you, Harry Potter. So I want you to take a second, again, just look at your worksheet. There's a section on your worksheet to type in the issues you see that are present in this email. So go ahead and think about, how does this email improve on the previous draft? Okay, so I hope you had enough time. If not, go ahead and pause here and then continue once you've finished. But in this email draft, I think it's a huge improvement from the previous one. So if you just go back, you can see a visual improvement, right? Just really quickly without reading it. And part of that is because of the way this person spaced out the email, right? So they put a space here where the greeting is, and a space in between the body and the closer. And that already looks much more organized to me as someone who's reading the email. Here, the greeting is smushed into the email body, and it's hard to differentiate the two. So it's a really good call in this revision that there is now spacing, because visually it just looks easier to read. Another improvement here is that the subject line is clear, right? So there is a reference to the class the student is in, and there's a clear and direct line about what they need help with, which is an appointment request. They also put the time of the class. You don't have to do that, but you can if you'd like. Again, it just adds to more of the specificity of your email. Another thing here is that in the greeting, the student chose to use dear and professor, right? So they defaulted to the gender neutral honorific of professor instead of Mrs. In the actual email body, there's a lot more punctuation and there's no internet slang. It's much easier to read and understand. The student also changes the demand, you know, I want to meet with you at 12 on this day, and instead post it as a question and said, would you be available to meet with me sometime this week? So that request already sounds a lot more understanding and a lot more mindful of the professor's time. So both of these emails are requesting the same thing. One is just much more mindful of the professor and their ability to meet with them. They also use a closer thank you and then first and last name so that the professor can easily identify the student, right? Because the first and last name are both there. Overall, this email improves a lot from the previous email because it's easier to read, it's professional and non-demanding in tone, and there's a clear beginning, middle, and end. So just like writing an essay, your emails also need to have a clear beginning, middle, and end. So this is it. This is an excellent improvement from the previous one. Okay, so for the next part of this workshop, you also want to think about one of your classes or professors and the current requests you might have. So you might already have a request that you've been thinking about, and maybe you didn't know how to broach that request with your professor, but with this workshop, hopefully now you feel more confident. But I want you to practice drafting an email with the request that you might have so that you can use it later. So even if you don't have a current request, think of something that you have emailed your professors in the past about and use that as you draft an email. So if you don't have a current request too, if there's not one you can think of that you've needed in the past, you can also practice using the prompt below. So I've given you this instructor name, the class, the time and day, and the reason for your email. So for this part of the workshop, I just want you to practice writing an email from beginning to end. There's a blank space on the DLA worksheet that is titled Practice Writing Your Email. And I want you to go ahead and practice typing out an email there. Again, you need the subject line, you need your greeting, you need your body, and you need your closer. And like I said, if you don't have a request that you currently have, you can practice by using this sample prompt. So I'm just going to give you a moment. And once you're done, let me know. Oh, just kidding. We're not in a virtual classroom. It's just a habit. But when you're done, just go ahead and continue with the workshop. So just pause it here, take a minute to draft your email, and then resume once you're ready. Okay, so I hope you had enough time. If not, go ahead and pause again and just take your time to finish up. So before you send an email, this is just a checklist of what you should do before you send an email. One, you should ask yourself, did you spell your professor's name correctly, right? So number one, make sure you're spelling the name correctly, right? So me, I've gotten a few students who email me and they have misspelled my name, right, in the past. And currently, I actually have some students that misspell my name when they email me. And it's not something that personally bothers me, but it just shows like a lapse of paying attention to me, just because I sign all my emails with my first and last name. So it just shows that you're paying attention when you spell their name correctly. Other professors might correct you, some won't. So just make sure you're spelling their name correctly by checking, you know, your Canvas page for their name, checking your schedule, or just checking the email signature, because I assure you your professor probably has one and they probably have spelled their name out in that signature. When you reply to an email, make sure you check if you're replying or replying all. Generally, if your professor sends an email to the whole class, if you aren't sharing something that the whole class needs to know, it's probably best just to hit reply. If you have something that needs to go out to the whole class, then you could select reply all, but most of the time I'm going to assume you're probably just going to need to reply. So just be careful before you send an email to make sure that you're hitting reply or reply all, depending on the circumstance. Did you spell check? So this is a simple one. You can spell check visually. So you can spell check by looking at the email. A lot of email programs, a lot of those email programs will automatically catch the mistakes for you, and they'll underline the words that are misspelled incorrectly in red. But not all of them do that. So it's easier to visually check an email yourself if you have a spell checker already embedded into the program you're using. But if you don't already have that program that is spell checking for you, you might want to even drop it in a Word document and have that spell check for you. Especially if you're sending an important email. If you're sending just a quick, brief email, I don't think there's any need to spell check your email. But if you're sending something with a much bigger request, you could do that. There's also things like Grammarly that you can use. You can download something for your browser and it'll spell check things on your browser when you're typing them out. So that's another add-on that you could use to spell check. Otherwise, like I said, you could either use Word or you can just visually spell check it yourself. But it's just important that you do spell check if you're sending a longer email. So the next point, were you angry or upset when you wrote the email? So this is one sometimes I've heard of people doing, is that they get really angry about something and they type out an email or a text message, right? This even happens with text messages. But before sending it, they let themselves cool off before sending that message, right? So it's just good practice if you are angry or upset, whether it be at the professor or if it's at something else and it's seeping into your writing, just sit on the email, right? So don't send it right away because you might unknowingly communicate your frustration in the email. And chances are that if you sit on it and wait, you might feel better later when you send the email. So it's just good practice to not send any emails if you're angry or upset, because chances are you might say something you regret, or you might say something in a way that you didn't realize you were saying it because you were angry. So it's just good practice to wait to send the email if you do feel angry or upset. The next point is, did you request permission to miss class? Right, so if you're in a synchronous Zoom course, you don't necessarily need to request permission to miss class, right? We all know you have personal lives, and in your lives, you know, things happen. You might have family emergencies, you might be sick, you might need a mental health day, right? So you do not need to ask for permission when you email your professors. So for example, I've seen emails where students say, is it okay if I don't come to class today? You do not need to word it that way. Instead, when you email your professor, just let them know, hello, Professor so-and-so, I'm going to be missing class today. I'll make sure to connect with one of my classmates to get the work that I missed during my absence. Right, so that's all you would need to say. You don't even need to tell your professor why you're missing class unless you want to, but you don't need to do that. It's just important that you're not requesting permission, but it is good practice to let your professor know when you miss class before you miss the class. It just keeps them on the same page as you, and they understand if something's going on. It's just good practice to let them know if you're going to miss class, just don't ask for permission to miss it. And then the last one, is your email too long? So this is subjective. It all depends on what you're emailing about. So if you are emailing about, you know, an absence, or if you're emailing about a question on the syllabus, and it's just a quick question, right? Is your email too long for the request that you're sending? Just ask yourself that, because if it is, you can probably edit it down. But it is okay to send long emails if you need to, right? So it's very different now. Before, when we were still in person, if you had a request that was better for a meeting, you would be able to just go to your professor's office hours or speak to them after class or before class, right? But now that we're remote, your email request could be longer just because that face-to-face meeting isn't possible anymore. Of course, you can always see if your professor is willing to do a Zoom meeting with you if you do have something that is better suited for a conversation. But I think it's much more acceptable now if you send longer emails because of this, the fact that we're not on campus. So this is very subjective. Like I said, just monitor what you're writing in the email and if it's pertinent to whatever you're sending. So after you've sent that email, it's out in the world, your professor has it in their inbox. There's just a few things you want to remember after you've sent it. So be patient. Remember that emails are not for issues that are time sensitive. So if you need help on an assignment and it's 11:45 p.m. and the assignment is due at 11:59 p.m. that same day, sending an email to your professor will not result in you getting help, most likely, unless your professor is awake at 11:45 at night. So time-sensitive issues like that, you can't expect a response right away. So if there are issues that are time-sensitive, just keep in mind that that response isn't going to come as soon as you'd like it to come. That's why it's great practice to plan out when you need to send emails. So if you know you're going to need help on your essay, or if you're going to need help on an assignment, you should plan to let the professor know ahead of time that you're probably going to need to meet with them about the assignment. That's just good practice because it helps you be more organized when going into your assignments. And it also does, it also helps you avoid from sending that stress email to your professor saying, hey, I really need help with this right now, right? So just plan ahead. And if you can't, plan ahead because it's too late, just be patient and know that your professor will probably get to the email once they get a chance. Next point, if you sent an email after 5 p.m. or on a weekend, you shouldn't expect a response immediately. So professors, we have lives, I guess, as there's no better way to put it, but we have our own lives outside of our job. So I personally don't answer emails after 6 p.m. Monday through Thursday unless there's a big project due. And then on Fridays, I end my email responses a little bit later, and then I generally don't check my emails on the weekend. Some professors do. A lot of professors will give you their average response time, and if they email on weekends, so it all depends on the professor, but general rule of thumb is if your professor hasn't let you know their email schedule, just know that if you send something after 5 or on a weekend or on a holiday, it probably won't be responded to right away. Last reminder is if you do not receive a reply after 48 hours, a gentle reminder or a kind follow-up email may be necessary. So, I try to get back to student emails as fast as I can. However, sometimes it might get lost in my inbox because I do receive a lot of emails on the daily. So if your professor hasn't responded to you and it's been 2 days, you can also just reach out to them and see if they received your email. One thing I like to do is I like to find the email I sent. So I'll forward the email I sent and just say something like, hi, I'm just checking in to see if you received this message and to see when you might be able to respond to this message, right? So just something gentle to let them know that you're just checking in to see if they have seen the message, something that communicates your understanding as to why it may be late. So that is good practice to just email someone if they haven't responded to you in 2 days. But again, you want to wait at least 2 days before you send an email, and that's 2 business days. So if you send an email Friday night and you still haven't received a response Monday morning, it's probably best just to wait, because your professor's probably still going through their email. So this 48-hour window reply is only applicable to Monday through Friday. So just keep that in mind. So for the last activity on the DLA, you're going to reflect on your current email writing process. So the way you wrote emails before taking this workshop. So what is something you plan on improving after completing this workshop? Think about that, use the space on the worksheet, and discuss 1 or 2 things about your own email writing you plan on improving after completing this DLA. So go ahead and pause here and fill that out. All right, so I hope you were able to think of at least 1 or 2 things you'd like to improve. Again, if there's nothing that you want to improve, or if you think you have great email writing skills already, that's awesome. You can also talk about practices that you already do in your own email writing. So I hope you found this workshop useful. Again, as a college student, especially in this pandemic, you're going to be sending a lot of emails. So I just wanted to help make that process easier. If you are interested in more workshops, please be sure to check the Writing Support Center Student Resources Canvas shell, the same place where you access this workshop, and you'll be able to find a schedule of workshops that are upcoming for this month. There's also already a large library of workshops available on the Canvas page in the module section under workshops. So if you haven't already, go ahead and check those out. You might find another workshop that you find useful. Thank you.